So in the background, you can probably hear big fans blowing as a result of my kitchen basically being torn up and having to be dried. So I apologize for that, but we'll do our best, that notwithstanding. So we're not going to get to the home front in terms of our discussion, as we're going to go just from the propaganda posters we did on Friday to the Treaty of Versailles and the outcome of the war. But I want to make sure that we understand the home front, because in every discussion of war, particularly in APUSH, we really look at what took us into the war, what happened in the home front, how we sort of sustained everything that was going on domestically while we fought abroad, and then what happens as a result. So I want you to understand, as we briefly touched on Friday, that the U.S. military was not ready for World War I. And as a result, there's going to need to be a draft. Now, we first saw a draft in the Civil War on both the North and the South. This is going to be the second draft that we have. It's called the Selective Service Act, which creates this draft, and you can follow along with me on the slide that says Building a Modern Army Quickly. Now, many people don't actually understand that the guy on the right is Jesus. This man subjected himself to imprisonment and probably to being shot and hanged. This prisoner used language tending to discourage men from enlisting in the U.S. Army. Goes through, and it talks about, really, it alludes to the fact about how Jesus would have likely been a conscientious objector, or a CO. And these were religious people, tended to be Amish, Mennonite, people who had sort of given up on technology and were famously pacifists. And they objected against fighting, and some of them were actually jailed for doing so. Now, when those who did show up as a result of being drafted or volunteered, they found that basically nothing was ready, which, as I've told you before, shouldn't really be a surprise. And as a result, despite the fact that we come in 1917, we're really not ready to fight for over a year. So it's going to take us a while to mobilize, and even when we go to Europe with the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, we don't start to fight immediately. Okay? Now, it's important to recognize also on this slide that African Americans could fight in the war, but they were in segregated groups. Now, again, we're going to have the same deal in World War II, and it's not going to be until the Korean War, as a result of an executive order by Harry S. Truman in between those wars, that actually integrates the military. Now, when we look at what happens on the home front, we got to pay attention to those posters and the type of propaganda that we discussed on Friday. So the first one we see is called the War Industries Board. And the WIB was really trying to ensure that business would follow the patriotism and the overall goals of World War I. It was trying to make sure that nothing was wasted, and they tried to set production quotas, like you got to make this much and you can't waste raw materials. But this was not a planned economy like you'd see in the Soviet Union, or even like we had in World War II. They tried to direct business to quote-unquote do the right thing, but they weren't terribly successful overall. Now, the Food Administration, led by future President Herbert Hoover, was quite successful. And this really involved the idea of self-sacrifice. So it had asked people to not eat meat on certain days and wheat on certain days, and as a gluten-free vegetarian, I would have done pretty well. They also asked people to plant victory gardens. That means to plant their own gardens so that they could actually sustain themselves. At the end of the war, we're going to see prohibition coming in. And again, it's sort of partly patriotism. We're fighting against the Germans, fighting against the Irish sort of indirectly, because the Irish don't like the English who we're fighting with. And those people are pretty big on beer. So the fact that we get the 18th Amendment towards the end of the war is both for food conservation and patriotism as well. Then the next slide, we're going to see the War Labor Board, which is led by former President William Howard Taft. And what we're trying to do here is make sure that workers don't strike so that you can keep those troops alive. Now, we saw that propaganda poster where rivets are bayonets. And remember, anytime that labor is asked not to strike, they also usually get something out of it. It is a quid pro quo. So they got themselves an 8-hour workday. And they were able to push for unions to be recognized. And again, they were urging equal pay for women, something that goes all the way back to the Knights of Labor. It never really gets satisfied, but they saw themselves in a pretty leveraged position. And just so you know, the Wobblies, the United Workers of the World, the most socialist of all the unions, they struck, and they struck many times over during World War I. They didn't care that we were at war. In fact, they argued that it was a war about capitalism, and in fact, they should strike as a result. On the next slide, you're going to see a reference to the 4-Minute Men. And these were groups of people, spokesmen, even actors, who went out and gave 4-minute speeches. This is sort of the most propaganda of all the propaganda efforts, in that they're trying to ensure that people get on board and that people are unified and that morale is high. There are going to be commercials, sort of commercials right before movies, which are starting out in the World War I era, sort of between 1910 and 1920, and they get popular in the 1920s. But this is going to be a very explicit effort to get the war message out. And then we have this whole idea of what is known as the fuel administration. What's interesting about the fuel administration is we actually get daylight savings as a result of trying to get longer days for workers. Again, this is all an idea of how productive can we be overall, and it's also going to push fuel conservation, heatless days, just like we had, wheatless days and meatless days earlier within the Food Administration that I talked about. But remember, the government itself can't finance a war, so it oftentimes relies on Americans to help finance it for them in the term of what we call bonds or IOUs. And we've had this going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. In this case, they're called Liberty Bonds. The government sells them to people, then the people hold them, and then at the end they're paid back at the end, usually with interest. So it's a major way to finance the war overall. Now, we also have to remember that in order to sort of boost American unity and morale, you got to be against the enemy sort of very, very strongly. And so there's going to be a strong anti-Germanic sentiment, despite the fact that Germans had been, really, like I said the other day, sort of the model European immigrant. But we're going to see schools not teaching German. We're going to see Wagner, who is a famous German composer, his music won't get played. We're going to get sauerkraut becomes Liberty cabbage, and hamburgers become Liberty steaks, and I think dachshunds, the little wiener dogs, become known as Liberty pups. And so you're going to have this very sort of, they are bad and we're not going to have any sort of association with Germans here in America. Now it's important to realize that women are always a significant, play a significant role during wars. And while they don't get to actually be out on the battlefield, very important oftentimes in keeping sort of the hearth and home going. Now, in this particular case, many women did leave their separate sphere, their domestic environment, and actually went and worked in factories. Now, we're not going to see sort of the Rosie the Riveter until World War II, but we're going to see about 1 million women working in munitions factories. Now, it's going to be interesting because we're going to see some of that bleed into the 1920s with the flapper movement, but for the most part, women sort of did their time. They helped keep the factories going as much as they could, and then when the men came back, they actually retreated back to the household. So it wasn't this sort of great moment of sort of writ large liberation as you might think overall. Yet at the same time, you've got women who are, as we saw during the discussion of the Progressive Era, very strongly and vociferously protesting how hypocritical it is that Woodrow Wilson is claiming to have a war to make the world safe for democracy, and yet at the same time he's not allowing women to have suffrage. And so we see in the suppressing opposition, we see people protesting out in front of the White House. And again, at the end of the war, we are going to see that the 19th Amendment is passed more sort of as a thank you to the more passive and supportive group like NASA and not Alice Paul's National Women's Party. But when we look at ways to suppress opposition, we want to think of the Espionage and Sedition Acts. I know it's confusing because we already had the Alien and Sedition Acts way back in the late 1890s, but in this particular case, what we're going to look at is, the first is the Espionage Act, which the whole goal of it was you can't interfere with military operations at all. You can't get people to want to be disloyal to the country. You can't encourage them to not go into the military. Really, you can't get in the way of what we're trying to do to push people to be patriotic and serve their country. And then the Sedition Act, which again we've seen a version of this before, is saying you can't basically speak out against the government. And again, it's much more sort of free speech as opposed to the Espionage Act, which is more sort of limiting actions overall. Interestingly, Edward Snowden, who is still in Russia and released all of those documents about the NSA back about 3 years ago, if he came home, he would be convicted under the Espionage Act. Now, there are people who thought that the Espionage and Sedition Acts violated the First Amendment, which in many ways they did. So there's going to be a case that we need to know called the Schenck versus the United States. Now, Schenck was a socialist, and Schenck didn't like the war. Schenck thought it was a capitalist enterprise. And so he starts putting out a bunch of materials that say, oppose this war. Now, he is convicted under the Espionage Act, and he says, listen, my free speech is being violated. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is a famous Supreme Court justice, famously said, you know what? If your speech creates clear and present danger, you lose your First Amendment rights. And so the whole idea of this is that if you said something during peacetime, it could be considered dangerous, if it's said during wartime, it could be considered dangerous, whereas in peacetime it wouldn't be. So there's sort of different conditions under which speech is free and speech is prohibited. Overall, I got to remind you, or I got to put out there, this is a sort of classic opportunity for an essay prompt. Either comparing World War I and World War II in terms of what kind of self-sacrifice they asked of people, as well as how they limited people's rights, as well as the way that people opposed the sort of government efforts in each war. Or if we're just looking at one war, it's important to realize sort of what is happening domestically. How are people working together, working with the government to sort of pitch in and keep everything going on at home. Again, there's not many sort of war questions in APUSH that have to do with the fighting. It's more what got you into the war, what's going on at home, how's the government mobilizing, how's the government keeping everything in line, and then what happens as a result.